Welcome to the ProcureTech podcast, bringing insight and inspiration into how digital technology is shaping our profession. I'm your host, James Meads, tea drinker, expat, and definitely not your typical consultant. So welcome to the very first episode of the ProcureTech podcast. And today, as a guest, I've brought on an old contact of mine who, well, actually, we first came in contact when I was working in freight and logistics procurement in the corporate world. And when I was buying freight and transportation, I came across Peter's company because he was asking me about opportunities within the organization I was working for. And to cut a long story short, we never actually implemented or ended up doing business together, but I always found the tool that he developed quite intriguing. And after we got connected on LinkedIn and learned a bit more about it, I thought that would be a really good first episode. So Pieter Kinds from TenderTool is my guest today, which is a new innovative way to purchase freight in a much more user-friendly method for both buyer and freight forwarder. Welcome, Pieter.
Thanks, James. Pleasure to be on your podcast.
Great. Okay, so let's start off. So first of all, Pieter, if you could just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do. I know you're from the Netherlands and you now live in Spain. And as someone that's also from an equally grey and rainy country, I kind of get that. The climate in Spain is definitely a plus point. And I really miss Spanish olive oil. I have a house in Spain, so I know it well. So yeah, just introduce yourself and we can go from there.
Yes, I am about 20 years in sales and predominantly have been in sales in the freight audit industry, so a sub-part of logistics. And for the last 4 years, I have been active for TenderTool as a CEO and also very much in business development, driving the growth of the freight sourcing platform that we offer.
Ah, that's interesting. So you're not from a procurement background. So what inspired you to create TenderTool?
So what I saw in my previous company, ControlPay, is that when you work with rates, you get new rates, accessorial costs, and business rules from after tenders, and you need to implement them to make sure that you have the correct invoices, the correct calculations, so that you pay the right amount to carriers. We found out that often after a tender, a lot of things are not taken care of. So business rules are unclear, let's say consolidation rules are not clear, rounding rules, weight break calculations. So you get a lot of discussion with the carrier what the interpretation of different rules and rates are. And then we said, okay, but probably we can do this better because obviously some tools or platforms in the market are not addressing this. So we said, okay, with our rate experience, the way you scrutinize rates and analyze them, we can build a tool that does all that automatically and forces basically the user to take such things into account. So that was the reason why we wanted to build such a platform. One reason. The other reason was that we saw that there are many tools in the market that do some procurement in logistics, yet we're not completely devoted to it, or we're very difficult to actually make all kinds of tenders happen via a platform. So you see that large tenders are typically being done with the help of consultants or a platform, whereas smaller tenders still go via Excel because it's not worth to pay the price and the effort to go through to use a platform. So we said, okay, we want to make it more complete and at the same time more dedicated to logistics. And we want to make it also more simple for all kinds of tenders instead of just the big European or region-wide tenders.
Yeah, and you raise a couple of really good points there because myself as a practitioner, I mean, I can see having used both Excel and one of the sort of legacy e-sourcing tools and I won't name them, but they were one of the first on the market. And quite frankly, I find it as a practitioner very clunky and definitely not very user-friendly. So what typically differentiates sourcing freight and transportation from maybe some of the other RFPs that centralized procurement teams or consultants would typically conduct? I mean, what are some of the nuances that with freight procurement, for example, makes it more difficult to utilize these more sort of standard tools?
When you look at different procurement areas, you see that logistics is the most complex area, because if you buy, for example, 1,000 components for a certain product that you are making, you buy the 1,000 components and you have one price per component, and that's it. With freight, you can have many different components actually in pricing. So you say, okay, this is the price per shipment, but it can depend on loading meter, it can depend on chargeable weight or on kilo, for example. And then you have the accessorial charges. Do you have specific cleaning charges or waiting costs, or do you need extra equipment to unload, or do you have refrigerated equipment? So you have many accessorials, and upfront you never know when you get the bill how many shipments were actually transported. So if you buy the 1,000 components, you should receive 1,000 components. But when you have the shipments, you may do 500 shipments this month, you may do 700, you may do only 300. And the different weight structures always define then afterwards the pricing. So you can never say upfront what it would be. So the complexity is much, much higher, and there are just different dimensions to them. Also, how they are being applied. So are the different shipments that leave the company today that go to a same address, are they being consolidated or are they not going to be consolidated? That's crucial for the pricing. So I would say in general, there's no, it is complex, and there's also no standards in the market to say, okay, this is how LTL shipments are being taken care of. This is the weight bracket structure for pallets or for kilos. Every carrier basically applies their own structures. So in order to make sense out of that, and to do a good tender, you need to have a system and a platform that is dedicated to address those specific logistics issues, instead of saying, oh, well, we just capture the pricing in our generic procurement platform, and then you can do the analysis offline, which you will need to do because there's no other way, because the platform as itself does not address the specific needs, so it doesn't give you really any value other than just pushing through the data that you receive from the different carriers.
Yeah, and that's certainly my experience too of using standardized e-sourcing platforms for doing tenders. I mean, if it's a commoditized product that you can very easily calculate, you know, how many you're going to use per year or per month, and you have a very specific specification that doesn't really change very much, then it's pretty easy. But you're right that freight is kind of a moving target. Well, literally is. And yeah, I mean, if you're in, for example, the FMCG industry, which I was, and you've constantly got new markets or new routes or new distribution channels that you're going into, it's difficult to have a fixed rate card with a fixed volume for a decent period of time because it's a constantly changing world. So yeah, thank you for those insights. That's really interesting, especially for anyone that's not an experienced transportation sourcing professional. It is quite a unique beast. So that would lead me on then to the next question, which would be, what are the most common mistakes that typically procurement teams are making when they're running freight tenders? And I guess let's assume for this purpose that they've got some past experience in purchasing transportation and that they're not coming into the role completely cold as a new commodity to them.
Well, what you often see is that the communication is lacking. So you see that people want to invite new carriers, but don't spend enough time in informing the carrier, in inviting them personally to the tender. They say, okay, well, we just want to invite 100 or 200 carriers, and just send them an email and we give them the data once they want to take part, and that's it. You need to establish some kind of a relationship, even though it can be just via email or by phone, so that they understand that you're interested in having them taking part. Because carriers nowadays, they do feel that they need to weigh their options, because they can take part in many tenders, but they need to understand if they have a fair chance at getting a part of the business, or are they just taking part because they need to be part of a certain volume of carriers that are invited. So I think that is very important. That's really the main factor. And the other main issue, I would say, is that the data quality, gathering the data, is often underestimated. Still, companies do not have good sources of data, and it always takes them way more time in order to gather that data in preparation of the tender.
Yeah, absolutely. I can certainly speak from personal experience that actually putting together the data for a freight tender is in a lot of cases much more difficult than actually analyzing the data once you've got it back from the quotations that you've received. And yeah, there are so many providers out there, and there are so many companies that do what you said. They send out a blanket email with an Excel file to a bunch of random forwarders saying, please give us some rates, with pretty much no specification, no service level agreement or anything. So that's sort of like, well, okay, well, where do we start? What do you want? Do you want cheap, fast, or good? Because, you can usually only have 2 out of 3, or even 1 out of 3 in some cases. So can TenderTool also handle spot rates as well as sort of fixed locked-in rate cards?
Yes, that's one of the features that we are offering as well. That's also something that the market is asking for more and more. Typically, companies do get about 25% of the spot market, and I feel that it also has become more important to have that flexibility of using the spot market in a fast and flexible way. What you see right now with the coronavirus, or with Brexit, or any other things that are happening, you need to be able to quickly react to changes in the market, and also capacity changes, because that's very vital. And you see that companies do struggle a lot with putting out spot bid requests, and that causes an enormous amount of work on the carrier side as well. So if you have a tool for that, it is beneficial for the shipper itself, but also for the carriers, because it makes it also a lot easier for them.
And it's a completely different market, I guess, as well, isn't it? Because if a company wants just a spot rate to do a couple of transport lanes here and there on a very ad hoc basis, that's going to be a hell of a lot different than working with a fully integrated third-party logistics provider like the DHLs or the DSVs of the world. It's kind of like 2 different markets.
Yes, it is. But I do feel that companies seem to want to have more flexibility nowadays, and are looking for spot market opportunities. And you see that also via the rise of many different platforms out there that provide these options, where also these forwarders are linked to, even though they have contracts with many different shippers.
Is freight sourcing, especially in Europe and on road transportation, you hear a lot these stories now, especially in places like Germany, that there are an acute shortage of truck drivers, and that's really driving up the cost of freight because of the higher salaries that pushes through. So is it also making it become more of a seller's market in the freight industry? Because typically for almost as long as I can remember, it's always been a buyer's market. There's always been a glut of transportation companies, but is that worm slowly turning, do you think?
Yes, I think it is. And it's definitely important. What I always tell our customers is that you need to sell your freight to your carrier. And then still you can get many companies to take part in your tender and to get good rates. But you need to take more effort and show that you're interested in the carrier, instead of the carrier showing interest in the shipper, into the buyer. So I think that has definitely changed. But shippers can turn that to their own positive way if they are more active, more proactive towards the carrier market. So I think that's definitely something they need to take charge to do that a lot better than they did before.
Yeah, and I think that's a very valid point, not just in sourcing transportation, but in sourcing in general, that even though it may be two large corporations sending a tender and responding to it, ultimately people want to do business with other people, and your relationship will thrive or fail based on you as the buyer and the interaction that you have with the key account manager at your supplier. There has to be some basic chemistry there to have a good working relationship. And there is some give and take. Even in a relatively commoditized market like freight, there still has to be that people connection to have a good ongoing relationship. And especially in times like today when we're recording this, where we've got a major force majeure event out in the world, coronavirus, and everything that's going on around us at the moment, as you mentioned, those strong relationships, even in this digitized world where a lot of processes and transactions can be automated with tools like what you've developed with TenderTool, that's still, the people-to-people part of business and relationships, regardless, still hold sway. So suppliers always used to comment when I was using e-sourcing tools that they hate them. And I think the reason is that a lot of e-sourcing tools are a bit crap. But here's the secret. Buyers used to hate using them too. And procurement professionals often say, it's good that suppliers hate using these tools, and it's good that we sort of hold the cards, and if they don't like it, then tough, because we have the power. But while it's true that e-sourcing definitely does drive down price and has a lot of benefits for the person that's sort of on with his buyer's hat on, is it possible, or are you finding with what you've developed, that even though TenderTool is obviously an e-sourcing tool, are you finding that freight forwarders in this case and buyers both can get to that point where they're both happy to use the platform? I mean, do you think that's achievable, or do you think that's always going to be an impossible dream?
I think it's inevitable. Because when you look at the market where it's going to, when you talk about artificial intelligence and you talk about that everything is becoming more data-driven, I think in the coming 5 years, this will completely change the way freight is being transactioned on many different platforms, because there's a lot of people work involved. But if you save the tender data, if you have good quality of data, then you can automate so much, because we should understand that tendering is a process that's coming back all the time. It's a sort of dance between the carriers and the shippers, but it's the same thing coming back time after time. And the people that have use the tools, that have good data, and use smart algorithms and can make use of artificial intelligence via new platforms, they don't need to really spend a lot of time on these platforms, because they know how to get the right pricing for the right lane or for the right product to their shippers, and that's where eventually it's going to. So I think it's inevitable, and also technology in general helps the buyer and the seller being more productive and focus more on value, because personally I think that people spend way too much time on tenders, make it way too difficult, whether that be in the preparation stage, whether during the tender, or whether doing everything manually in the tender if they do not use a platform, or like you say, an old school platform. They can do this work so much more efficient if they use technology and if they understand that this can be highly automated, and that's going to be eventually the future. And we should also realize that the freight industry has a lack of logistics specialists. So often you have people working on tenders that are not really qualified for it or lack logistics. So if you want to use your scarce logistics resources in the best way, you should deploy technology so they can focus on value.
Absolutely. And one of the things with having a more user-friendly platform in play is that whereas in the past, maybe a buyer would have gone and done a freight tender once a year or once every 2 years and then packed it away in a folder and never looked at it again, or even in a virtual folder on his hard drive. If you've got a user-friendly platform that both the buyer and the supplier in equal measure find easy to use, don't find cumbersome, then that could significantly engage the interaction that both parties have in terms of real-time updating and the ability to update rate cards, if there are better rates in the market, or if there are constraints that mean that prices may have to go up in the short term because of coronavirus, for example, or an oil crisis, any sort of major geopolitical event. It does give that flexibility without having to do all sort of follow-up subsequent correspondence on paper or on emails, which also is a time suck, and it's also bad in that that information then is not centralized in the same place. So if you've got an easy to use electronic tool that can do that, surely that's one of the biggest selling points of using something like this.
Absolutely.
Okay, so my final question, Pieter, is all about your plans in terms of growth. So you're a pretty young company, and I know you're still growing, and I saw this week on LinkedIn that you're hiring more developers. So can you share any exciting new plans or anything that you've got in the pipeline? And yeah, what direction generally do you see yourself taking the business?
So next to freight sourcing, which we are expanding, we have created a platform which is a unique platform for forwarders where they can manage their incoming tenders. So you see enormous struggle with forwarders managing the different air and ocean tenders that they receive on an annual basis. Typically, they have around 300, 400 tenders. And the process internally within those forwarder organizations is completely manual to get the quotation process. And a lot of people are involved in that. So we made a solution for that. And currently we are working with a handful of large forwarders. And we tend to have about 10 new forwarders onboarded this year on a global scale on that platform. And last but not least, we have created a new platform, which is soon to be launched. And that platform will give an opportunity for carriers to find new tenders to take part in, and for shippers to actually find new carriers. And we bring those two together on one platform, not just like a database which sits under a freight sourcing platform, but really a very interactive platform where when you upload your shipment profile, automatically you will get suggestions on what carriers matching carriers you can invite to your tender, and basically create a virtual database of those carriers. And the carriers have the opportunity to push news items and all kinds of updates that they have, but also keep their information up to date, so that shippers can easily find them and use them for upcoming tenders.
So that's it. In simple terms, it's like an online dating platform to match carriers and buyers alike. And I think that's great, because when you've got a mutual interest to make a relationship work and to drive a win-win, then the relationship between buyer and supplier, or between customer and forwarder in this case, is automatically already off on the right foot. Whereas if you're just doing freight sourcing the traditional way and just contracting random forwarders by email or by phone and trying to find out if they're interested in your routes or your lanes, it just makes that process that much faster using a tool like this. And as such, I think that will just be a lot more rewarding for both parties, I guess.
Yes, well, also here, algorithms can do a big part of the work.
Okay, fantastic. So, Pieter, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast, and really appreciate what you're doing in terms of making the freight sourcing industry much more simple for both buyers and vendors alike. I think that's really needed, because the existing legacy e-sourcing platforms out there don't really do what we need to be able to do to get reliable and flexible freight rates for a much more complex tendering process. So Pieter, if anyone wants to connect with you, I mean, the website is tendertool.com, but if anyone would like to catch up with you personally or maybe schedule a conversation to learn more, to explore some of the do's and don'ts of freight sourcing and what TenderTool can offer them, where can they find you?
You can always link with me on LinkedIn or find me at p.kinds@tendertool.com.
That's Kinds. Okay, so Pieter, all the best. Thanks again for joining me. And I really look forward to seeing how TenderTool develops. And who knows? Maybe next time I'm in Andalusia, we can meet up somewhere on a nice, warm, sunny day for some red wine and tapas and some of that lovely Spanish jamón ibérico, because I really, really miss that.
That would be great. Well, thanks a lot, James. I really appreciate it. It's my pleasure.
And that wraps up the very first episode of the ProcureTech podcast. I hope you found Pieter's interview useful and that it gave you some insights and food for thought around what you're maybe not doing optimally with your own freight or transportation procurement. If you like the ProcureTech podcast, then definitely catch up with us again for another interview next week. In the meantime, because we're a new project, I would really appreciate if you would follow us on LinkedIn or go and subscribe to us on your favorite podcast player. It would really mean a lot as we can reach more people, as we can grow faster. Thanks again for listening, and I will speak to you next time. Thanks again for listening to this episode of the ProcureTech podcast. If you like the show, then please subscribe, or even better, why not write us a quick review on Apple Podcasts? It would not only really make my day, but it would also help our mission to enable procurement and finance leaders to become more data-driven through the power of digital transformation.